ารวบอาณาจักรสุโขทัยไว้ในกำมือแล้วเริ่ม
The story of Ong Bak too takes us far away from the modern world and into a violent period of ancient Thailand, where kingdoms, warriors, nobles, and ruthless warlords fight for power, and at the center of this brutal world is a young boy named Tien, whose life is about to be destroyed by betrayal, violence, and the murder of his family. But before Tien becomes the extraordinary fighter audiences eventually know, he is simply the son of a respected nobleman who believes that honor and loyalty are more important than political power. And this peaceful beginning makes the tragedy that follows even more powerful, because Tien grows up surrounded by privilege and tradition, yet his father's position also places the family in danger, as powerful enemies begin viewing them as obstacles to their own ambitions, and the political environment around Tien becomes increasingly unstable, with rival factions fighting for control and powerful men using assassinations and deception to remove anyone who stands in their way, and Tien's father is eventually targeted by people who want to destroy his influence, forcing the young boy to witness events that will permanently change his life because the people he trusts are betrayed, his family is attacked, and the security he once believed he had disappears almost overnight. And Tien is forced to confront violence before he is old enough to understand the complicated politics behind it, and the emotional impact of these events becomes the foundation of his transformation, because Tien does not simply lose his family, he loses his identity, his home, and the future he was supposed to have, and from that moment forward his life becomes a struggle for survival, while the people responsible for his suffering continue to hold positions of power, and this creates the central motivation that will eventually drive Tien toward becoming a warrior. But at the beginning of his journey, Tien is still inexperienced and vulnerable, and although he has been raised around martial traditions, he does not yet possess the extraordinary fighting ability that will later make him one of the most dangerous warriors in the story, and this vulnerability makes his situation even more tragic because he cannot simply fight his way out of the danger surrounding him. So when his enemies move against his family, Tien is captured and thrown into a world where survival depends on strength, instinct, and the willingness to fight, and the young boy who once lived in a world of honor is suddenly forced to witness cruelty on a scale he never imagined, and as Tien struggles to survive, survive. He encounters people who recognize that he possesses unusual potential, even though that potential has not yet been developed, and one of the most important figures in his transformation is a mysterious warrior connected to a group of fighters who understand many different martial arts traditions, and this encounter changes the direction of Tien's life because instead of allowing the boy to remain helpless, the warriors begin teaching him how to survive, and Tien's education is not based on one single fighting style because the world he enters is filled with different martial arts techniques, weapons, philosophies, and combat traditions, and this becomes one of the defining characteristics of Ong Bak too, because Tien's fighting style eventually becomes a combination of multiple disciplines, reflecting not only his physical training but also the different teachers and warriors who influence him along the way. And as Tien begins learning, he discovers that martial arts are not simply about punching, kicking, or defeating an opponent. They are also about balance, timing, discipline, awareness, patience, and understanding the weaknesses of another fighter. And this lesson is extremely important because Tien's greatest weakness at this stage is his anger, and his anger is understandable because he has lost almost everything. But uncontrolled anger can make a fighter reckless, and the people training him understand that if Tien allows hatred to control him, he may become no better than the people who destroyed his family. So his training becomes a battle between his desire for revenge and the discipline required to become a true warrior, and this internal struggle is one of the most important aspects of Tien's character because he is not simply learning how to fight physically, he is learning how to control the emotions that could ultimately destroy him, and the training itself becomes extremely demanding, with Tien being exposed to different weapons and combat methods that force him to adapt constantly, and instead of becoming an expert in only one discipline, he gradually learns to combine different techniques into a unique fighting system, and this makes him unpredictable because an opponent cannot easily determine what style Tien will use next, and one moment he may rely on powerful strikes, while another moment he may use fluid movement, grappling, weapon techniques, or deceptive footwork, and this variety eventually becomes one of his greatest advantages. But before Tien reaches that level, he must endure years of difficult training, and the process is not easy because he is often physically exhausted, emotionally unstable, and haunted by memories of his family, and every time he remembers the people he lost, his desire for revenge becomes stronger. But his teachers continue reminding him that revenge without discipline will only lead to destruction, and this creates a powerful contrast between the boy Tien was and the warrior he is becoming, because the young Tien is driven by emotion, while the future warrior must learn to turn that emotion into controlled strength, and this transformation is shown through the physical challenges he faces because his body is pushed beyond what he believed possible, and he learns how to move faster, strike harder, maintain balance, and use his entire body as a weapon. But the most important lesson is that no fighter can rely on strength alone because every opponent has different abilities, and survival requires intelligence, adaptability, and awareness. And as Tien continues training, he is introduced to different warriors who each possess their own unique fighting methods, and these encounters expand his understanding of combat, because instead of viewing martial arts as separate systems, Tien begins understanding that every style has strengths and weaknesses, and the key to becoming a great fighter is learning how to use those strengths while protecting against those weaknesses, and this philosophy eventually shapes the way he fights, making him extremely difficult to predict. And the training environment also introduces Tien to a different kind of family because although he has lost his biological family, the warriors who train him begin becoming important figures in his life, giving him guidance, discipline, and a sense of belonging. And this is significant because Tien's emotional journey is not simply about revenge, it is also about finding a new identity after losing the old one. And the martial arts community becomes the place where he begins rebuilding himself, but the memories of his past never disappear, and whenever he thinks about the people responsible for his suffering, the old anger returns, and this creates moments where Tien must choose between patience and revenge, and the people training him understand that this choice will ultimately determine what kind of warrior he becomes, because a fighter who cannot control his emotions can be defeated even by a weaker opponent, while a fighter who understands his emotions can use them as fuel without allowing them to control his decisions. And Tien slowly begins learning this difference, although the process is painful and his teachers challenge him repeatedly. forcing him to confront not only physical opponents but also his own fear, frustration, and anger. And through this process, Tien becomes stronger, but he also becomes more isolated because the deeper he enters the world of martial arts, the more distant he becomes from the ordinary life he once knew, and his transformation begins creating a sense that he is preparing for something much larger than simple survival, because the people who destroyed his family still exist and eventually Tien will have to face them. But before that confrontation can happen, he must become powerful enough to survive the world they control. And this is why his training is so important, because it gives him the tools he will eventually need to challenge people who appear almost untouchable. And as the years pass, Tien's body and mind change, and the frightened boy gradually becomes a disciplined warrior. But his journey is far from complete, because the political world around him is also changing and powerful leaders continue fighting for control, while assassins and warriors are used as instruments of political ambition. And Tien begins realizing that the people responsible for his family's destruction are connected to a much larger network of power, meaning that revenge will not be as simple as finding one enemy and defeating him. And this realization gives his mission a larger scale, because Tien is not simply fighting against one individual, he is entering a world where betrayal can come from anyone, and where political alliances can change without warning, and this atmosphere of uncertainty makes trust extremely difficult. And Tien learns that even people who appear friendly may have hidden motives, while people who appear dangerous may sometimes become unexpected allies, and this complexity becomes a major part of the story, because the world of Ong Bak 2 is not divided into simple heroes and villains. Instead, it is filled with warriors and leaders who each have their own ambitions, loyalties, fears, and secrets, and Tien must learn to navigate this world while continuing his training. And as his skills improve, he begins participating in real combat rather than training exercises, and these encounters teach him lessons that cannot be learned from practice alone, because real opponents do not follow rules and they do not always fight fairly. And Tien discovers that survival sometimes requires improvisation, especially when weapons, multiple attackers, or unexpected circumstances become part of the battle. And this forces him to use everything he has learned, and the more he fights, the more his confidence grows. But his teachers continue warning him not to become arrogant, because confidence can quickly turn into recklessness, and Tien must learn to respect every opponent regardless of their size or reputation. And this is especially important because some of the most dangerous fighters are not necessarily the strongest looking people, and the film repeatedly emphasizes that appearances can be deceptive. And Tien's own appearance eventually becomes misleading as well, because the quiet young man who appears physically controlled is capable of tremendous violence when necessary, and this contrast gives his character a powerful presence. And as Tien continues his journey, he also encounters a mysterious and beautiful warrior woman named Pim, whose presence adds another emotional dimension to his story. And Pim is not simply a romantic figure, because her own connection to the world around Tien is complicated, and her presence introduces questions about trust, affection, and the possibility of finding something human in a life increasingly dominated by violence. And Tien's relationship with her develops slowly because he is emotionally wounded and focused on revenge, but her presence reminds him that his life could potentially contain something beyond hatred. And this becomes important because Tien's greatest danger is not necessarily losing a fight, it is allowing revenge to consume every part of his identity. And Pim represents the possibility that he could still maintain compassion and emotional connection despite everything he has suffered. And their interactions provide a contrast to the brutality surrounding them, because while Tien's training is about becoming stronger, his relationship with Pim reminds him why humanity matters, and this emotional balance becomes increasingly important as his enemies begin moving closer. And meanwhile, Tien's skills continue developing at an extraordinary rate, and his ability to combine different martial arts becomes more advanced, with each style contributing something different to his overall fighting ability. And he begins learning how to transition between techniques without hesitation, allowing him to respond to different attacks almost instinctively, and this eventually creates the distinctive fighting style that makes him so dangerous. But his training also involves weapons, and Tien becomes skilled with blades, staffs, and other traditional weapons, learning not only how to attack but how to use an opponent's weapon against them. And these lessons reinforce the idea that a true warrior must be adaptable, because no battle is ever completely predictable, And the training also teaches him to use his environment, turning objects, terrain, and positioning into advantages. And this becomes especially useful because many of the fights Tien eventually faces will not happen in controlled arenas, they will happen in forests, villages, buildings, and other unpredictable locations, and his ability to adapt to his surroundings becomes another major strength. And as Tien's reputation begins spreading, people start recognizing that the young warrior is becoming something special, but his enemies do not yet understand exactly how dangerous he will become. And this gives Tien an advantage because he can continue developing without attracting the full attention of the people who destroyed his family. And meanwhile, the political forces responsible for the violence continue strengthening their positions, and Tien's personal revenge becomes connected to a much larger conflict, and he begins realizing that defeating individual fighters will not be enough because the people at the top are protected by layers of soldiers, assassins, and political influence, and this makes his mission increasingly difficult, but it also gives him a larger purpose, because if he can survive long enough to challenge the people responsible, he may be able to expose the truth behind his family's destruction and finally reclaim the honor that was taken from him. And this is where the story's themes of loyalty, betrayal, honor, and revenge become deeply connected, because Tien's father represented an older ideal of honor, while the people who destroyed him represent a world where power matters more than loyalty, and Tien finds himself caught between those two philosophies, and his training becomes a way of preserving the values his father taught him while also developing the strength necessary to survive in a corrupt world. And this creates an interesting contradiction, because Tien wants revenge against people who use violence for political power, yet he must become increasingly skilled at violence himself, and the question becomes whether he can use violence without becoming consumed by the same darkness that destroyed his family, and this question follows him throughout the story. And as part 1 of his journey progresses, Tien is no longer the helpless child who watched his world collapse. He is becoming a warrior capable of standing against experienced fighters, but the transformation is still incomplete because his anger remains powerful and the memories of his family continue influencing his decisions, and his teachers know that the final test will not be physical, it will be whether Tien can control the darkness inside him when he finally comes face to face with the people responsible for his suffering. And the road toward that confrontation is filled with more training, more battles, more betrayal, and more discoveries about the political forces surrounding him, while his connection with Pim gives him a reason to believe that life can still contain something besides revenge. And as Tien looks toward the future, he understands that becoming a great fighter is only the beginning, because strength alone cannot restore his family or erase the past, and eventually he will have to confront the men who took everything from him. But before he can reach them, he must survive the dangerous world that stands between them, and that means continuing to train, continuing to learn, and continuing to control the anger that has followed him since childhood. And with every new technique he masters and every opponent he defeats, Tien moves closer to becoming the warrior he was destined to become. But the closer he gets to his enemies, the more complicated his journey becomes, because the world of Ong Bak 2 is built on deception, violence, and shifting loyalties, and Tien will soon discover that the greatest threat may come from someone he never expected, while the lessons of his teachers, the bond he develops with the people around him, and the memory of his family will all be tested. And as the young warrior prepares for the next stage of his journey, the peaceful life he once knew feels like a distant memory, because Tien has crossed a point from which there is no easy return, and the path ahead will demand everything he has: his strength, his discipline, his courage, and most importantly, his ability to decide whether he will become a man controlled by revenge or a warrior strong enough to rise above it, and that question will shape everything that follows in his extraordinary journey. As Tien continues his transformation from a frightened young survivor into a highly skilled warrior, the world around him becomes increasingly dangerous, and the lessons he has learned through years of training begin preparing him for battles that will test not only his physical abilities but also his emotional control. Because Tien's greatest motivation remains the desire to understand and eventually avenge the destruction of his family. Yet, the more he learns about the world of warriors and political power, the more he realizes that the people responsible for his suffering are connected to a much larger network of betrayal and ambition. And this means that revenge will not be as simple as finding one enemy and defeating him, because every powerful figure seems to have allies, hidden motives, and personal agendas. and Tien must learn to navigate this complicated world while continuing to improve his fighting skills. And his training becomes increasingly intense as his teachers expose him to different martial arts styles and weapons, forcing him to develop an ability to switch between techniques without hesitation. And this unusual approach to combat eventually becomes one of the defining characteristics of Tien's fighting style, because instead of becoming dependent on one discipline, he learns from many different warriors, absorbing their movements, philosophies, and methods. And each teacher contributes something different to his development, teaching him that fighting is not simply about strength but about understanding distance, timing, balance, rhythm, and the intentions of an opponent. And these lessons slowly transform Tien's body into a weapon capable of responding instinctively to danger. But his teachers also understand that physical skill alone is not enough, because Tien's anger remains a powerful force inside him. And although anger gives him motivation, it can also make him reckless. And they repeatedly challenge him to remain calm when provoked, because a warrior who loses control of his emotions can easily become predictable. And Tien begins learning how to turn his anger into focus rather than allowing it to control him. Although the process is difficult, because memories of his family continue returning whenever he is alone, and he remembers the violence that destroyed his childhood and the helplessness he felt when he could do nothing to protect the people he loved. And those memories become both a source of pain and a source of strength, because they remind him why he refuses to remain weak. And as his training progresses, Tien begins taking part in more serious fights where he faces opponents who have years of experience and specialize in different forms of combat. And these battles force him to apply everything he has learned, because unlike training sessions, real opponents do not stop when Tien makes a mistake, and they are willing to exploit every weakness they see. And Tien quickly discovers that some fighters are extremely fast, others rely on brute strength, some specialize in weapons, and others use deceptive movements designed to confuse their opponents. And each battle teaches him something new, allowing him to expand his understanding of combat. And this constant learning becomes one of his greatest advantages, because Tien never assumes that he already knows everything. Instead, he observes his opponents carefully and adjusts his strategy. And this ability to adapt eventually makes him incredibly unpredictable, because an enemy who expects a conventional martial artist may suddenly find himself facing a completely different style. And Tien can change his approach depending on the situation, using kicks, elbows, knees, punches, throws, weapon techniques, and evasive movements in combinations that make his attacks difficult to anticipate. And the choreography of these fights reflects the character's development, because the audience can see that Tien is no longer simply learning how to fight, he is creating his own identity as a warrior, and every technique he learns becomes part of a larger system that reflects his experiences, his teachers, and his determination to survive. But despite his growing ability, Tien remains emotionally conflicted, because the stronger he becomes, the closer he feels to the people he wants to confront. And this creates an internal tension between patience and revenge, because his teachers want him to continue learning until he is ready, while his anger constantly tells him that he should act immediately. And this conflict becomes even stronger when he begins learning more about the political forces responsible for his family's downfall, because he discovers that the people involved are not simply random enemies. They are powerful figures who have built their positions through violence, deception, and alliances, and they have access to armies, assassins, and influential supporters, meaning that Tien cannot simply walk into their territory and expect to survive. And this realization forces him to become more strategic, because if he wants revenge, he must first understand the world he is fighting against. And this is where his education as a warrior becomes connected to his education as a survivor, because he learns to watch people, understand their motivations, and recognize that political power can be just as dangerous as physical strength. And meanwhile, Tien's relationship with Pim begins developing in a more meaningful way. And although their connection is complicated by the violent world around them, Pim provides Tien with moments of peace that he rarely experiences elsewhere. Because when he is with her, he can temporarily forget the anger and fear that have shaped his life. And she reminds him that he is still capable of caring for someone despite everything he has suffered. And this emotional connection becomes increasingly important because Tien's greatest danger is the possibility that revenge will consume his entire identity. And Pim represents an alternative future, a possibility that he could live for something rather than simply fight against someone. And although Tien does not easily express his emotions, his relationship with her reveals that beneath the warrior is still the same young man who once loved his family and wanted a peaceful life. And this makes his journey more tragic because the audience can see what he has lost and what he might still lose if he allows hatred to control him. And at the same time, Tien's reputation as a fighter continues growing, and people begin to recognize that he is becoming one of the most dangerous young warriors in the region. But his enemies do not yet fully understand how powerful he has become, and this gives him an advantage because he can continue training and preparing while remaining relatively underestimated. And the people who once saw him as a helpless child would never imagine that he could eventually challenge the powerful figures responsible for his family's destruction. But Tien's transformation is not complete yet, and he still has much to learn, especially about the darker side of combat, because his training has mostly taught him how to survive and defeat opponents, but the world he is entering will require him to understand deception, ambushes, political manipulation, and the possibility that allies can become enemies. And this becomes clear as Tien encounters more people whose loyalties are uncertain, and he begins realizing that trust must be earned rather than assumed. Because the world of powerful warriors is filled with people who may appear honorable while secretly serving their own interests. And this lesson is painful because Tien wants to believe that honor still exists, especially because his father represented that ideal. But he sees evidence that many powerful men have abandoned such principles, and this creates a philosophical conflict inside him. Because if the world is corrupt, how can he maintain his own honor while seeking revenge? And this question becomes increasingly important as he gets closer to his enemies, because revenge can easily become an excuse for cruelty, and Tien must decide what kind of warrior he wants to be. And his teachers continue emphasizing discipline because they understand that his future depends on this decision, and the training becomes not only physical but spiritual, teaching him that a warrior's greatest victory is not necessarily defeating another person but controlling himself. And although Tien struggles with this idea, he gradually begins to understand why his teachers are so strict. Because every time he loses control during training, he makes mistakes. And every mistake reminds him that anger can become a weakness. And he starts learning to breathe, observe, and wait, turning his emotional energy into concentration. And this development becomes visible in his fights because earlier he attacked with desperation, while now he begins fighting with patience, waiting for openings and using his opponent's momentum against them. And this change makes him far more dangerous because an emotional fighter can be manipulated, but a disciplined fighter can choose exactly when to attack. And Tien is slowly becoming the second type, although his desire for revenge remains deeply buried inside him. And as he continues fighting, he encounters opponents who use weapons and unusual techniques, forcing him to expand his skills even further. And these battles become opportunities for him to learn how to fight in different environments. Because a warrior who can only fight under perfect conditions is not truly prepared for war. And Tien begins learning how to use terrain, obstacles, and movement to his advantage, turning the environment into part of his fighting strategy. And this adaptability becomes particularly important because many of the battles he will eventually face will take place outside controlled spaces where anything can happen. And Tien's ability to remain aware of his surroundings allows him to survive situations where other fighters might become overwhelmed. And his training also teaches him to respect weapons rather than fear them, understanding that a weapon is simply an extension of the person using it. And this philosophy allows him to become skilled with various traditional weapons, giving him another advantage against opponents who depend heavily on one particular tool. And as his skills continue growing, Tien begins to look less like a student and more like a complete warrior. But his emotional journey remains unfinished, and the memory of his family continues haunting him, especially when he thinks about the people responsible for their deaths. And sometimes this anger becomes so strong that he wants to abandon all caution and attack immediately. But the people around him try to stop him, reminding him that revenge without preparation can lead to failure. And Tien slowly accepts that patience is not cowardice, it is preparation. And this lesson becomes crucial because his enemies are powerful enough that one mistake could end his life. And if he dies before confronting them, his family's story may never be answered. And this thought motivates him to continue training. And meanwhile, the political situation around him continues changing, with powerful factions competing for control. And Tien begins seeing how easily people can manipulate warriors for political purposes, because soldiers and assassins are often treated as tools by rulers who never enter the battlefield themselves. And this reminds Tien of the tragedy that destroyed his own family, because his father was targeted as part of a larger political struggle. And Tien begins realizing that his personal story is connected to the larger conflict surrounding him. And this gives his mission greater meaning, because if he can survive and uncover the truth, he may be able to confront not only the people who directly harmed his family, but also the system of betrayal that allowed them to do it. And this realization changes the way he views his future, because revenge alone is no longer enough. He wants justice and truth, even though he does not yet know exactly how he will achieve them. And his journey becomes increasingly dangerous as he approaches the world of powerful warriors and rulers. And one of the most important aspects of this stage is Tien's growing confidence, because although he remains cautious, he begins believing in his own abilities, and this confidence allows him to challenge stronger opponents, but it also creates a new danger, because confidence can easily become arrogance, and his teachers continue testing him to make sure he understands the difference. And Tien's most important lesson is that there will always be someone stronger, faster, or more experienced, meaning that the only way to survive is to remain adaptable. And this philosophy becomes deeply connected to his fighting style, because he does not limit himself to one method. Instead, he constantly changes depending on what the situation demands, and this makes his movement unpredictable and visually spectacular. But beneath the impressive action is a deeper story about identity, because every technique Tien learns represents another part of the person he is becoming. And the combination of different martial arts reflects his refusal to be defined by the tragedy of his childhood, because he is creating something new from everything he has experienced. And as he becomes more skilled, his connection with the people who trained him also becomes stronger. And although they cannot replace his family, they provide him with guidance and a sense of belonging. And this is important because Tien's transformation could easily have turned him into a completely isolated figure, but instead he begins learning the value of loyalty and friendship. And these relationships eventually become essential when his enemies begin moving against him. Because a warrior can be powerful alone, but a group of loyal allies can provide information, protection, and emotional support that no fighting technique can replace. And Tien begins understanding this as he watches how different warriors support each other, and he realizes that true strength is not always individual. Sometimes it comes from the people who stand beside you when everything becomes dangerous. And this lesson also deepens his relationship with Pim, because she becomes one of the few people who can reach the emotional side of him that his teachers cannot. And her presence gives him a reason to imagine a life after revenge. Although Tien remains uncertain whether such a life is possible, because he believes that his past has already determined his future. And this belief becomes one of the central emotional struggles of his story. Because if he believes he is destined only for revenge, then every act of violence becomes easier to justify. But if he allows himself to imagine a future beyond hatred, he must confront the possibility that his entire mission could change. And this conflict becomes increasingly intense as Tien approaches the people connected to his past. And the more information he discovers, the more he understands that betrayal may be closer than he realizes, because some of the people he trusts may not be as loyal as they appear. And the film begins creating an atmosphere where almost every relationship carries uncertainty. And this makes Tien's journey emotionally dangerous as well as physically dangerous, because he must decide whom to trust while knowing that a wrong choice could cost him his life. And at the same time, his enemies are beginning to realize that the young warrior they once underestimated is becoming a serious threat, and they may soon begin searching for him. Meaning that the period of quiet training is coming to an end, and Tien will soon be forced to put everything he has learned to the test. And this is where the story begins moving toward a larger confrontation, because Tien has reached a level where he can no longer remain hidden forever, and his skills will eventually attract the attention of powerful figures. And when that happens, he will have to decide whether he is ready to step into the world of those responsible for his suffering. And as the second stage of his journey comes to a close, Tien has become far more than the frightened boy who survived a terrible attack. He is now a highly trained warrior with an extraordinary understanding of martial arts, weapons, strategy, and discipline. But the darkness inside him remains, and the memory of his family still burns in his heart, meaning that his greatest challenge is not yet behind him, because the true test will come when he finally faces the people who represent everything he has spent years preparing to confront. And whether he can control his anger when that moment arrives will determine whether he becomes a hero seeking justice or a warrior consumed by revenge. And with Pim and his allies offering him reasons to preserve his humanity, and his enemies preparing for a world of conflict that they do not yet understand, Tien moves closer to the point of no return, knowing that the skills he has spent years developing will soon be tested in battles far more dangerous than anything he has faced before. And the boy who once had no power is now preparing to challenge an entire world built on violence, betrayal, and ambition. And his journey is only beginning to reveal how much he will have to sacrifice before he can finally confront the truth behind his family's destruction. As Tien's skills continue developing, the peaceful period of training slowly begins to disappear because the world around him is becoming increasingly unstable, and the powerful people responsible for the violence surrounding his family are moving closer to the center of his life, while Tien himself is becoming a warrior whose abilities can no longer remain hidden forever. And this creates a dangerous situation because the more powerful he becomes, the more attention he attracts, and the people who once believed that Tien was only a helpless survivor are beginning to realize that the boy they thought they had forgotten has grown into someone capable of challenging experienced fighters. And this realization becomes particularly important because Tien's enemies have spent years building their influence, surrounding themselves with soldiers, assassins, and loyal servants, while Tien has spent those same years learning how to fight, adapt, and survive. And although he is now incredibly skilled, he understands that skill alone will not be enough to defeat an entire network of powerful enemies. So he begins thinking more strategically about how to approach his revenge, and this is where his development as a warrior becomes connected to his development as a man, because he is learning that courage does not mean attacking every enemy immediately. It means knowing when to fight and when to wait, and his teachers have repeatedly tried to teach him this lesson, reminding him that anger can make even the strongest warrior careless. and Tien begins to understand that patience is one of the most dangerous weapons a fighter can possess, because when an opponent becomes impatient, they reveal their weaknesses, and Tien's ability to remain calm allows him to recognize those weaknesses before they become obvious, and this becomes clear during his encounters with increasingly skilled fighters, because he no longer rushes into combat simply because he is angry. Instead, he studies his opponent, observes their movements, and searches for patterns, and once he understands the rhythm of the fight, he begins changing his own style to exploit their weaknesses. And this ability to combine different martial arts gives him an advantage that few opponents can predict, because Tien can move from one technique to another without hesitation, and the transitions between styles make his attacks seem almost impossible to anticipate, and this is not simply a result of physical talent, it is the product of years of painful training and countless failures, because every mistake has taught him something, and every defeat has forced him to become more disciplined, and now the lessons of his teachers are beginning to come together, creating a fighter who can use speed, power, balance, flexibility, weapons, and strategy as parts of one unified system. And as Tien's reputation grows, he begins attracting the attention of people connected to the larger political world, and this is where his personal journey becomes intertwined with the struggle for power surrounding him, because the same forces that destroyed his family are still operating, and they are using warriors as tools to protect their interests. And Tien realizes that if he wants to reach the people responsible for his suffering, he must understand how these political alliances work, because simply defeating individual fighters will not change the system that created them, and this realization makes his mission more complicated. Because he begins seeing that many of the warriors he encounters are not necessarily evil people, they are sometimes simply serving someone more powerful, and this raises difficult questions for Tien, because if he defeats everyone standing in his way, he may end up destroying people who are not directly responsible for his family's tragedy, and his teachers have warned him about this possibility, telling him that a warrior must understand the difference between justice and revenge, and this distinction becomes increasingly important as Tien approaches his enemies, because revenge seeks to satisfy anger while justice seeks to restore balance, and Tien must decide which one he truly wants. And although his heart still burns with hatred, his growing maturity allows him to question whether killing everyone connected to his past will actually give him peace, and this internal struggle becomes one of the most important parts of his journey, because Tien is slowly realizing that defeating his enemies may not erase the memories of his family, and no victory can return the people he lost. But he still believes that confronting the people responsible is necessary, because otherwise the injustice will remain unanswered, and this conflict between emotional revenge and moral justice gives his character greater depth. And while Tien struggles with these questions, his relationship with Pim becomes more meaningful, because she represents a part of life that exists outside violence, and whenever Tien is with her, he is reminded that he is still capable of compassion, affection, and hope, and although he rarely speaks openly about his emotions, his behavior around Pim reveals that he does not want to become completely consumed by violence, and she sees the pain beneath his calm exterior, understanding that the warrior everyone fears is still carrying the wounds of a young boy who lost his family, and this connection gives Tien emotional strength, but it also creates vulnerability, because anyone who wants to hurt him could potentially use his feelings for Pim against him, and Tien begins to understand that protecting the people he cares about may be just as important as defeating his enemies, and this changes the way he approaches danger, because earlier he was willing to risk everything for revenge, but now he has another reason to survive, and that reason gives his life greater meaning. And meanwhile, the political conflict surrounding Tien becomes increasingly intense, with powerful factions competing for control, and warriors being sent to eliminate rivals, and the world around him becomes filled with suspicion, betrayal, and violence, and Tien begins noticing that the people at the top rarely fight their own battles. Instead, they send others to do their dirty work, and this reminds him of the circumstances that destroyed his family, because his father was targeted not simply because of personal hatred, but because powerful people wanted to remove an obstacle to their ambitions, and Tien realizes that the true enemy may be larger than he initially believed, and this discovery gives him a new purpose, because he wants to uncover the chain of events that led to his family's destruction, and understand who truly benefited from it, and this requires him to gather information as carefully as he gathers fighting techniques, and he begins observing conversations, alliances, and movements, learning that knowledge can be just as valuable as strength, and this is another sign of his transformation, because the boy who once reacted emotionally to every threat is becoming a warrior capable of planning several steps ahead, and his teachers recognize this development, but they also know that the closer he gets to the truth, the greater the danger will become, because powerful people rarely allow their secrets to remain exposed, and if they realize that Tien is investigating them, they may attempt to eliminate him before he becomes a serious threat. And this possibility eventually becomes a reality as Tien's name begins circulating among people who have reason to fear him. And suddenly, the warrior who once moved quietly through the shadows becomes a target, and this forces him to rely on every skill he has developed because his enemies no longer underestimate him, and they begin sending fighters who are specifically chosen to counter his abilities. And these opponents are not ordinary warriors, they are highly trained specialists with their own unique techniques, and each encounter becomes a test of whether Tien's diverse fighting style is truly enough to overcome experienced masters, and rather than relying on one predictable method, Tien changes his approach repeatedly, using the lessons of his teachers to adapt to each opponent, and this creates some of the most intense battles of his journey, because the fights are not simply about physical strength, they are about reading another human being and understanding how they think, and Tien begins recognizing that every fighter has a rhythm, a habit, or a weakness, and once he discovers it, he can use that information to create an opening, and this makes him increasingly difficult to defeat. But the battles also reveal the physical cost of his lifestyle, because no matter how skilled he becomes, every fight leaves injuries, exhaustion, and emotional scars, and Tien begins realizing that becoming powerful does not mean becoming invulnerable, and this is important because his revenge mission requires him to survive long enough to reach his ultimate target, and if he allows anger to push him beyond his physical limits, he may lose everything before the final confrontation, and his allies repeatedly remind him of this, while Pim encourages him to think about the future rather than allowing the past to control every decision, and although Tien struggles to accept this idea, her influence begins changing him, because for the first time since losing his family, he begins imagining a life where he might not have to fight forever, and this possibility frightens him because it means he would have to let go of some of his anger, and anger has become part of his identity, but deep down he knows that if he wants peace, he cannot carry hatred forever. And this becomes one of the central emotional conflicts of the story, because Tien must decide whether revenge is worth sacrificing the possibility of happiness. And the answer is not simple, because justice for his family still matters deeply to him, but he is beginning to understand that revenge can become another form of imprisonment, and if he allows hatred to control him, the people who destroyed his family will continue controlling his life long after they are gone, and this realization slowly begins changing his motivations, although he is not ready to abandon his mission. He starts seeing it differently, and instead of wanting to destroy everything around him, he begins wanting to confront the people responsible and reclaim his honor. And this shift makes him a more mature warrior, but it also makes the upcoming conflict more complicated because his enemies will not care about his emotional development. They will simply see him as a threat, and they begin preparing to eliminate him. And as Tien's reputation spreads, more warriors are drawn into the conflict, some seeking to defeat him for fame, others working for powerful leaders, and some simply wanting to test themselves against the fighter whose abilities have become legendary. And Tien's encounters with these warriors provide opportunities for him to learn even more, but they also remind him that the world of martial arts is not always honorable, because some fighters cheat, ambush, or attack from unexpected directions, and Tien must learn to survive situations where there are no rules, and this forces him to become more ruthless when necessary, but he still tries to maintain the principles his father taught him. And this balance becomes increasingly difficult because the world around him rewards cruelty while Tien wants to preserve honor. And this tension becomes visible in the way he treats defeated opponents, because although he is capable of extreme violence, he does not always seek to destroy people who are no longer a threat, and this suggests that despite everything he has suffered, the original values of his family are still alive inside him. And this becomes important later because his enemies will attempt to provoke him into becoming the monster they expect him to be. But Tien's greatest victory may be refusing to become what they want. And as his journey continues, he begins moving closer to the powerful figures connected to his past, and the atmosphere around him becomes increasingly tense because everyone can sense that a major confrontation is approaching, and Tien's allies understand that once he steps fully into the political world, there may be no way back, and this creates fear because they know how powerful his enemies are, but Tien refuses to retreat because after years of preparation, he finally believes he is ready to face the world that destroyed his family, and his confidence is no longer based on anger alone. It is based on experience, discipline, and the knowledge that he has survived challenges that once seemed impossible, and this is where his transformation reaches another important stage because he is no longer fighting simply to become stronger. He is fighting because he understands that strength must serve a purpose, and his purpose is to confront injustice and protect the people he loves, and this gives his fighting a deeper meaning. And as he moves toward the center of the conflict, he discovers more about the political forces around him, including the ambitions of powerful leaders who are willing to sacrifice anyone to gain control. And this information makes Tien realize that his father's death was part of a larger struggle, and that the people responsible may have been manipulating events for years, and this revelation makes him angry. But instead of allowing that anger to overwhelm him, he uses it to sharpen his focus because now he understands what he is fighting against, and the clearer his purpose becomes, the more dangerous he becomes to his enemies, and they begin preparing their strongest warriors to stop him while Tien prepares to face them. And the coming battles will test everything he has learned, including his ability to use multiple martial art styles, his skill with weapons, his strategic intelligence, and his emotional discipline. But perhaps the greatest test will be whether he can protect the people around him without losing himself, because every person he cares about becomes another potential target, and Pim's presence makes this especially important because Tien knows that his enemies may try to use her as a way to control him, and he becomes increasingly determined to keep her safe, even if it means placing himself in greater danger. And this reveals another side of his character, because the warrior who once fought only for revenge is now willing to fight for someone else's future. And that is a major sign that his humanity has survived his suffering. And as the conflict intensifies, Tien begins moving toward a confrontation that will change his life forever. But before he can reach the people at the top, he must survive a series of increasingly dangerous encounters, and each battle pushes him closer to his physical and emotional limits, and the more he wins, the more his enemies understand that ordinary methods will not be enough, and they begin considering more ruthless strategies, including deception and betrayal. And this is where Tien's trust in the people around him will be tested, because the world he has entered is one where appearances can be misleading, and a person who claims loyalty today may betray you tomorrow. And Tien must remain alert even among those he considers allies, and this uncertainty creates a powerful sense of tension because the audience understands that the greatest threat may not always be the warrior standing in front of him, it may be the person standing beside him, and Tien's journey therefore becomes a constant test of judgment, and as he prepares for the next stage, he carries the lessons of his teachers with him, remembering that strength without discipline is dangerous, that anger without control can destroy its owner, and that true warriors must understand why they fight. And Tien now has a clearer answer than ever. He fights because he refuses to allow the people he lost to be forgotten. He fights because he wants to confront the injustice that destroyed his family, and he fights because he wants to protect the people who have become important to him, and these motivations make him stronger than the angry boy he once was. But they also make the stakes higher, because failure would not only mean losing his own life, it could mean losing the last pieces of the family and humanity he has rebuilt. And as Tien stands on the edge of the larger conflict, the peaceful world of his childhood has completely disappeared, replaced by a world of warriors, assassins, rulers, and betrayal. But he is no longer afraid of that world because he has spent years preparing for it, and with every breath, every movement, and every memory, he becomes more determined to face the people who changed his life forever. And the next stage of his journey will push him into battles where there will be no easy escape, no guarantee of victory, and no certainty about whom he can trust, but Tien is finally ready to enter that darkness, carrying with him the skills of countless teachers, the memory of his family, the love he feels for Pim, and the determination to discover whether a man shaped by revenge can still choose his own destiny. And as he takes another step toward his enemies, the line between justice and revenge becomes thinner than ever, setting the stage for the violent and emotional events that will define the final stages of his journey. As Tien moves closer to the powerful forces connected to his family's destruction, the world around him becomes more dangerous and unpredictable, because the years of training that transformed him from a helpless boy into a formidable warrior have finally brought him to the point where his enemies can no longer ignore him. And although Tien has learned to control his anger and use his emotions as a source of focus, the closer he gets to the people responsible for his suffering, the more difficult that control becomes. Because every discovery brings back memories of the violence that destroyed his childhood, and every new enemy reminds him of the helplessness he once felt when he was unable to protect his family. But Tien is no longer that powerless child, and the difference between the boy he was and the warrior he has become is now impossible to ignore. Because he can face experienced fighters without fear, adapt to unfamiliar techniques, and use multiple martial arts styles in a way that makes him extremely difficult to predict. Yet despite his physical strength, Tien understands that his greatest challenge is still emotional, because revenge has been the central purpose of his life for so long that he does not know what will remain of him once that purpose is fulfilled. And this question becomes increasingly important as Pim continues to remind him that life can contain something beyond violence, because whenever Tien is with her, the world seems quieter, and for a short time he can forget the bloodshed, political conspiracies, and memories that have followed him since childhood. But Tien knows that the people around him are not safe simply because he wants peace, and his growing reputation has already attracted dangerous attention, meaning that anyone connected to him could become a target, and this forces him to make difficult choices about whom he can trust. And as he moves deeper into the conflict, Tien discovers that political power has created a world where loyalty is often temporary, because warriors serve leaders who may change alliances whenever it benefits them, and men who appear honorable can hide ruthless ambitions behind respectable positions, while people who seem dangerous may sometimes have their own reasons for opposing the same enemies. And Tien must learn to distinguish between appearances and reality, because a single mistake could place him directly in the hands of people who have been searching for him. And this makes his journey more than a series of physical battles, because he is also fighting a battle of information, trying to understand who is responsible for what has happened and who might be manipulating events from the shadows. And the deeper he investigates, the more he realizes that the destruction of his family was not an isolated act of violence, but part of a larger struggle for power, and this revelation makes his anger even stronger, because he begins understanding that the people responsible did not simply destroy his family because of personal hatred. They did it because his family stood in the way of their ambitions. And the idea that innocent lives could be sacrificed for political power disgusts Tien, especially because he remembers his father's belief in honor and responsibility. And this contrast between his father's values and the corruption surrounding him becomes one of the most important themes of his journey, because Tien has spent years learning how to fight in a world where violence is common, but he still carries the moral lessons he learned before his family was destroyed. And the challenge is finding a way to use violence without becoming corrupted by it. And this becomes particularly difficult when he faces opponents who deliberately provoke him, because they know that anger can make him reckless, and they attempt to push him into attacking without thinking. But Tien's training has taught him to recognize this strategy, and instead of immediately reacting, he begins slowing down, observing his opponents and waiting for the moment when their confidence turns into a mistake. And this patience becomes one of his most powerful weapons, because his opponents expect the angry young warrior they have heard about. but instead they find a disciplined fighter who can remain calm even when surrounded by danger. And this creates a psychological advantage before the physical battle has even begun. And when the fights finally start, Tien's unique combination of martial arts becomes increasingly spectacular, because he can move from one technique to another without losing balance or rhythm, using his entire body with extraordinary control, and his movements reflect everything he has learned from the different masters who shaped him, with each style contributing a different quality to his combat, and this makes him difficult to read, because an opponent who prepares for one style can suddenly find himself facing another. And Tien also uses weapons when necessary, demonstrating that his training has prepared him for more than hand-to-hand combat, and the weapon sequences are especially important because they show how quickly he can adapt, using the environment and the tools around him as extensions of his own movement. And this ability to adapt becomes essential as the conflict becomes more chaotic, because Tien cannot control where his enemies will attack or what methods they will use, and he must be prepared for anything. And as his enemies begin sending stronger warriors against him, Tien realizes that these battles are no longer random encounters, because someone is deliberately testing his abilities, trying to learn his weaknesses before sending an even more dangerous opponent. And this creates a deadly game in which every victory gives Tien more information but also alerts his enemies to his growing strength. And Tien understands that he cannot remain in one place for too long, because the longer he stays, the easier it becomes for his enemies to track him and the people around him, and this forces him to move carefully, relying on the support of people he trusts. And during this period, his relationship with Pim becomes increasingly important, because she represents the emotional connection that keeps him from becoming completely consumed by revenge. And although Tien knows that being close to her places her in danger, he cannot simply abandon her, because she has become one of the few people who can see the person beneath the warrior. And she understands that Tien's anger comes from grief rather than cruelty, and this allows her to challenge him when he becomes too focused on revenge, reminding him that the people he lost would not want him to destroy himself. And Tien struggles with this idea because part of him believes that letting go of hatred would mean betraying the memory of his family, but another part of him is beginning to understand that carrying hatred forever does not honor the dead. It only gives the past control over the future, and this internal conflict becomes stronger as he approaches his enemies, because for years he has imagined the moment when he would finally confront the people responsible. But now that moment is beginning to feel real, and he must ask himself what he will do when he finally has the power to take revenge, and whether he will be able to stop himself from becoming the same kind of ruthless man he despises. And this question gives his journey an emotional weight that goes beyond the action, because every fight is also a test of his character, and every victory forces him to decide what kind of man he wants to become. And as Tien continues fighting, he encounters opponents who represent different aspects of the violent world around him. Some fighters are motivated by pride, others by money, others by loyalty to powerful leaders, and some simply enjoy violence. And by facing them, Tien learns that physical strength can come from many different motivations, but none of those motivations are as powerful as his determination to protect the people he loves. And this gives him a unique advantage, because he is willing to endure pain that other fighters would not tolerate. But it also makes him vulnerable, because the people he loves can be used against him. And his enemies begin recognizing this, creating situations designed to force Tien into emotional decisions. And this becomes one of the most difficult challenges he faces, because he must protect others without allowing fear to destroy his judgment. And his teacher's lessons about discipline become more important than ever, because Tien realizes that true strength is not simply being able to defeat someone, it is being able to choose how and when to use that strength. And as the political conflict intensifies, Tien begins seeing the larger consequences of the struggle around him. Because ordinary people are suffering while powerful men compete for control, and this reminds him of his own family. because they were also caught in a struggle they did not create, and Tien begins to understand that his fight is not only personal anymore, because the same system of violence that destroyed his family continues threatening others, and this gives his mission a greater sense of purpose, because if he can confront the people responsible, perhaps he can prevent them from continuing to destroy innocent lives. And although Tien still wants revenge, he begins thinking about justice as well, and this change shows how much he has matured since the beginning of his journey, because the boy who once wanted only to hurt the people who hurt him is slowly becoming a warrior who understands that actions have consequences, and this maturity does not make him weaker. Instead, it makes him more focused, and his fighting becomes more controlled and efficient, because he no longer wastes energy on anger. And when he enters combat, every movement has a purpose, and this is reflected in the increasingly complex fights he faces, where he uses combinations of attacks, defensive movements, throws, weapon techniques, and environmental awareness to defeat opponents who are physically powerful and highly experienced. And the violence is brutal, but Tien's ability to remain focused demonstrates how far he has come, and after each fight, however, he is reminded that victory comes with a cost, because his body is becoming increasingly damaged, and even the strongest warrior cannot continue fighting forever without consequences, and Tien knows that the final confrontation may demand everything he has left, so he begins preparing mentally as well as physically, and his preparation includes confronting his own fears, because he understands that his enemies may know about his family and may use those memories to manipulate him, and he must be ready to face the truth without allowing it to destroy his judgment. And this becomes especially difficult when new information about the past begins emerging, because Tien learns that some of the events he believed he understood may have been more complicated than he realized, and the people involved may not have been exactly who he thought they were, and this forces him to question some of his assumptions. But instead of abandoning his mission, he becomes more determined to uncover the truth for himself, because he no longer wants to rely only on anger or rumors. He wants to know exactly what happened, and this desire for truth separates him from the people who seek power through deception. And as he gets closer to the center of the conflict, he begins encountering stronger resistance, with warriors appearing who are clearly connected to powerful leaders, and these encounters make it obvious that the people at the top are now aware of Tien's presence, and they are beginning to see him as a serious threat. And once that happens, the nature of his journey changes, because he can no longer move freely and every step becomes dangerous. Every meeting could be a trap, and every new ally must be carefully evaluated. And Tien becomes more cautious, but he also becomes more confident in his ability to survive, because he has faced enough danger to know that fear does not have to control him. And this is one of the greatest changes in his character, because at the beginning of his journey, fear was something that overwhelmed him, while now he can acknowledge fear and still move forward. And that is what makes him a true warrior, not the ability to feel nothing, but the ability to act despite fear. And as the pressure increases, Tien's bond with his teachers becomes even more important, because they have become the closest thing he has to a family, and their guidance reminds him that he is not alone, even though the path he has chosen is dangerous. And they understand that eventually Tien must face his past himself, because no teacher can fight that battle for him, and they prepare him for the possibility that the final confrontation may not end the way he expects, and this warning stays with Tien as he moves forward, because he knows that revenge rarely provides the simple satisfaction people imagine, and there may be consequences even after victory, and this becomes another reason for him to remain disciplined, because he wants to survive long enough to build a future after the conflict. And Pim represents that future, while his teachers represent the values that shaped him, and his family represents the past he is trying to honor. And Tien stands between all three, trying to decide who he will become. And this emotional struggle reaches a turning point when he realizes that the people he has been searching for are finally within reach, and the possibility of confronting them fills him with both excitement and fear, because for years he imagined this moment, but now that it is approaching, he understands that there is no way to know what will happen once he crosses that final line, and he begins preparing for a confrontation unlike anything he has faced before, because his enemies will not fight fairly, and they will use every advantage available to them, including numbers, weapons, deception, and political power. But Tien has something they do not understand, the ability to adapt, and after years of learning from different warriors, he has become almost impossible to predict, and this makes him a dangerous opponent even for people with greater resources. And as the final stage approaches, the tension between Tien and his enemies becomes almost unavoidable, because both sides understand that a confrontation is coming, and neither side is willing to retreat. And Tien knows that he may not survive, but he also knows that turning away now would mean allowing the people responsible for his family's destruction to continue living without consequence, and this thought gives him the courage to continue. But he also remembers Pim's warnings and his teacher's lessons, understanding that his goal should not be to destroy himself through hatred, but to confront the past and choose his own future. And this becomes the central challenge of his character, because he must enter the final battle without allowing the final battle to become the master of his emotions. And as he prepares, he begins reviewing everything he has learned, the discipline of his teachers, the techniques of the many martial arts masters, the weapon skills that allow him to adapt, the strategic lessons that taught him patience, and the emotional lessons that taught him the value of loyalty and compassion. And all of these experiences have transformed him into someone completely different from the boy who once stood helpless in the face of violence. And now Tien is ready to step into the world that once destroyed him, but he is doing so on his own terms. And as he approaches the final confrontation, he knows that the greatest battle will not simply be between two fighters. It will be between the man he has become and the darkness that has followed him since childhood. And whether he can defeat his enemies without allowing hatred to defeat him will determine the meaning of everything he has endured. And with Pim still representing hope, his teachers representing wisdom, and his family's memory representing the reason he began this journey, Tien moves forward toward the most dangerous chapter of his life, knowing that there may be no return, but also knowing that he can no longer run from his past, and the warrior who was once created by tragedy is now approaching the moment when he must decide whether tragedy will define him forever or whether he will finally take control of his own destiny. The moment Tien has been preparing for throughout his entire life is finally approaching, because after years of training, countless battles, painful losses, and an endless struggle against the anger inside him, he is now standing closer than ever to the powerful forces responsible for the destruction of his family. But instead of feeling the satisfaction he once imagined, Tien begins to understand that reaching his enemies is only the beginning of the final test, because the people waiting for him are not ordinary warriors. They are connected to a world of political power, betrayal, and violence, and they have spent years protecting themselves from anyone who might challenge their authority, while Tien has spent those same years transforming himself into a fighter capable of surviving almost anything, and this creates an inevitable collision between two completely different worlds, one built on control and fear, and the other built on determination and the desire for justice. But before Tien can reach the center of that conflict, he is forced to confront another series of challenges designed to weaken him, and these battles become increasingly brutal because his enemies now understand that he is not someone they can defeat easily. So instead of underestimating him, they begin using stronger fighters, more dangerous tactics, and carefully planned attacks, hoping to overwhelm him before he can reach the people at the top. But Tien has spent years learning how to fight exactly this kind of battle, and his greatest advantage is his ability to adapt, Because unlike fighters who depend on one style, Tien can move between different techniques almost instinctively, using his experience with various martial arts to respond to whatever appears in front of him. And when one opponent relies on power, Tien uses speed and movement. When another depends on speed, he uses timing and positioning. And when a fighter uses weapons, Tien adjusts his distance and uses the environment to create opportunities. And this ability to change his strategy in the middle of combat makes him extremely difficult to defeat. But the fights also reveal that Tien is becoming increasingly exhausted because his body has suffered years of punishment, and although his determination remains strong, he is still human, and every injury reduces the amount of strength he has available for the final confrontation. Yet Tien refuses to stop because he knows that there may never be another opportunity to confront the people responsible for his family's destruction, and this knowledge pushes him forward even when his body tells him to rest. And at the same time, his enemies are becoming more desperate because every time Tien defeats another warrior, the possibility of him reaching their leaders becomes more realistic, and this means that the people at the top can no longer hide behind their soldiers forever. And they begin looking for ways to manipulate Tien emotionally, understanding that his love for his family and his feelings for Pim are the most powerful forces in his life, and they attempt to use those emotions against him, hoping that anger will make him careless. But Tien has changed too much for the old tactics to work easily because he has learned that anger can be controlled, and although he still feels rage when he thinks about his family, he no longer allows that rage to determine every decision, and this is one of the greatest signs of his growth because the boy who once wanted nothing but revenge has become a warrior capable of understanding that revenge without control can destroy the person seeking it, and Tien begins seeing the final conflict as an opportunity not only to punish those responsible, but also to reclaim the part of himself that was taken away when his family was destroyed. And this makes his mission more personal than ever because he wants to prove that the people who tried to erase his family did not succeed in destroying everything they loved, and the fact that Tien has survived and grown stronger becomes its own form of victory. But he still needs to confront the people responsible, and as he moves deeper into their territory, the atmosphere becomes increasingly tense because every person around him seems to have a hidden agenda. And Tien realizes that he cannot trust appearances, and this forces him to rely on the instincts developed through years of training, observing body language, movement, and behavior to determine whether someone is truly an ally or secretly working against him. And this ability to read people becomes as important as his ability to fight, because the political world around him is filled with deception, and the physical victory can mean nothing if an enemy has already manipulated the situation from the shadows. And Tien begins understanding that the people responsible for his family's destruction have survived not because they are the strongest fighters, but because they understand how to control other people. And this realization makes his mission even more complicated because he must defeat not only physical opponents but also the system that protects them, and his teacher's lessons about patience and awareness become more important than ever because Tien knows that rushing into the wrong situation could destroy everything he has worked for. And meanwhile, Pim continues to represent a different path for him, one based on compassion rather than revenge, and her presence reminds him that he still has something to lose because before he met her, Tien was willing to sacrifice himself without hesitation, but now he understands that his death would hurt the people who care about him, and this changes the way he approaches danger because although he remains willing to fight, he no longer sees death as the only possible ending, and this subtle change gives him a stronger reason to survive. And Pim also helps him understand that honoring his family does not require him to destroy himself, because the people he lost would want him to live, and this idea becomes increasingly important as Tien prepares for the final battle, because he realizes that the ultimate victory would be meaningless if he cannot imagine a life after revenge. And for the first time, he begins thinking beyond the past, imagining a future where he could leave the world of violence behind. But that future remains uncertain because the political conflict around him is becoming more dangerous, and the people responsible for his suffering are determined to eliminate him before he can expose their actions. And this leads to a series of confrontations that push Tien to his physical limits, with each opponent testing a different aspect of his abilities. And these fights become increasingly intense because the enemies understand his style better now, meaning that Tien can no longer rely solely on surprise, and he must constantly evolve, using new combinations and unpredictable movements to stay ahead, and this is where the full value of his training becomes clear. because every lesson he has received over the years becomes useful in a different situation, and instead of seeing martial arts as separate systems, he uses them as a flexible language of combat, switching between them according to what the moment requires, and his movements become faster, more fluid, and more controlled, while his understanding of distance and timing allows him to attack without wasting energy, and when an opponent attempts to overwhelm him with brute force, Tien uses their momentum against them, and when another tries to trap him, he changes direction and creates space, and when surrounded by multiple threats, he uses positioning to prevent them from attacking simultaneously, and these techniques show how much he has evolved from the frightened child at the beginning of the story, but even with all his skill, Tien cannot avoid the emotional consequences of his journey, and memories of his family continue appearing at the worst possible moments, reminding him of why he started, and sometimes the memories bring pain, but they also remind him that his family represented more than tragedy, because his father taught him about honor, loyalty, and responsibility. And Tien begins realizing that the best way to honor those lessons is not to become consumed by revenge, but to remain the kind of person his father would have respected, and this realization gives him a new kind of strength, because instead of fighting only against his enemies, he is now fighting to protect the values he inherited from his family. And this makes the final confrontation a battle over identity as much as power, because the people who destroyed his family want to define him through violence, while Tien wants to prove that he can use strength without becoming controlled by hatred, and this conflict reaches a critical point when he finally comes face to face with the consequences of the political world that shaped his childhood, and the truth surrounding his family's destruction becomes more difficult to ignore. And Tien realizes that betrayal was not simply an accident, it was part of a deliberate struggle for power, and this knowledge brings back the anger he has spent years trying to control, but instead of losing himself, he remembers the lessons of his teachers and the words of Pim, and he chooses to remain focused, because if he allows rage to take over, he will become exactly what his enemies expect. And the final confrontation will become a victory for them even if he defeats them physically, and this realization gives him the emotional control necessary to continue, and as the final battle approaches, Tien prepares himself mentally, understanding that there is a real possibility he may not survive, but he refuses to allow fear to stop him, because he has already survived the worst moment of his life when he lost his family, and everything since then has been a journey toward reclaiming his identity, and now he is ready to face the people who represent the source of his pain. And when the confrontation finally begins, it is not a simple fight, because it involves multiple forces, shifting loyalties, and the consequences of years of political manipulation, and Tien is forced to fight with everything he has learned, using his martial arts, weapons, speed, strength, and strategy, but the most important weapon remains his ability to stay focused, and the battle becomes a demonstration of how far he has come, because every movement reflects the years of training that transformed him, and every decision shows the emotional growth that allows him to fight without losing himself. And although the fight is brutal, Tien refuses to give in, because he knows that stopping now would mean allowing the past to control him forever. And his determination inspires the people around him, especially those who have watched his transformation from a wounded boy into a powerful warrior. And as the battle continues, Tien is pushed beyond his limits, taking injuries and suffering exhaustion, but he continues moving forward because he understands that strength is not the absence of pain, it is the decision to keep going despite it, and this becomes one of the defining ideas of his character, because he has spent his entire life learning how to survive pain, but now he must learn how to survive without allowing that pain to define him. And as he fights, he remembers the people who helped him along the way, his teachers who gave him the skills to survive, Pim who reminded him that life could still contain love, and his family whose memory gave him the reason to continue, and these memories give him strength when his body begins to fail. And eventually Tien reaches the point where his greatest enemies can no longer hide behind their warriors, and the conflict becomes deeply personal, because the people responsible for his suffering are finally within reach, and Tien must decide how far he is willing to go, and this is the moment where the distinction between revenge and justice becomes most important, because he has the power to destroy the people he hates, but destroying them will not bring his family back, and he must choose whether to allow hatred to determine his actions or to remain true to the principles that shaped him. And this decision becomes the ultimate test of his character, because everything he has learned about martial arts, discipline, and honor leads to this moment, and the audience can see that Tien is no longer the same person who began the journey, because he has developed the ability to look beyond immediate anger and consider the consequences of his choices. and even though he remains deeply wounded, he now understands that the future matters as much as the past, and this realization gives his final actions greater emotional meaning, because whatever happens next, Tien has finally begun breaking free from the cycle of violence that controlled his life, and his enemies may have created the warrior they feared, but they did not succeed in destroying the humanity inside him. And as the conflict reaches its most intense stage, Tien finds himself surrounded by chaos, with warriors attacking from different directions, weapons being used against him, and the political struggle collapsing into open violence. But he continues fighting, using every technique he has learned and every instinct he has developed, and the battle becomes a final demonstration of his adaptability, because he moves between styles seamlessly, using kicks, strikes, throws, weapon techniques, evasive movements, and environmental awareness to survive. And even when he is knocked down, he rises again. Not because he believes he is invincible, but because he knows that giving up would mean surrendering the future he has fought so hard to create. And this determination becomes the emotional heart of the final act, because Tien's journey has always been about rising after being destroyed, and every time the world knocks him down, he finds another reason to stand. And now that reason is no longer simply revenge, it is the possibility of freedom, the possibility of love, and the possibility of finally living as the person he chooses to become. And as the battle moves toward its conclusion, Tien is forced to confront the darkest part of himself, the part that still wants to punish everyone who caused his suffering, but instead of surrendering to that darkness, he recognizes it and chooses not to let it control him. And this decision marks the final stage of his transformation, because the true victory is not simply defeating an enemy, it is proving that the enemy cannot determine who you become. And Tien's family was taken from him, his childhood was destroyed, and his life was shaped by violence, but he still has the ability to choose his own future, and that choice is something his enemies can never take away. And as the final conflict begins settling, Tien realizes that the journey has changed him in ways he never expected, because he entered the world of martial arts seeking power, but he found discipline, friendship, loyalty, and love, and he entered seeking revenge. But he discovered that justice requires more than anger, and he entered as a wounded child, but he emerges as a warrior who understands both his strength and his weaknesses, and although the road ahead remains uncertain, he is finally ready to face it, because he no longer needs the past to tell him who he is, and he no longer needs revenge to justify his existence. And with the memory of his family still alive inside him, the guidance of his teachers still shaping his decisions, and Pim representing the possibility of a different future, Tien moves toward the final moments of his journey, carrying the scars of everything he has survived, but also carrying the knowledge that those scars do not have to control him, and the warrior who once believed that his destiny was determined by tragedy is finally beginning to understand that destiny can be challenged. And as the dust settles around him, the true cost of his journey becomes clear, because victory has never been simple for Tien. Every step forward has required sacrifice, and every lesson has come through pain. But now he stands closer than ever to freedom, and the final question is whether he can survive the consequences of everything that has happened and finally escape the cycle of violence, because the battle may be nearly over, but the emotional consequences of his choices are only beginning, and Tien must now face the final chapter of a journey that began with the destruction of his family and transformed him into one of the most extraordinary warriors of his generation. The story of Ong Bak 2 takes us far away from the modern world and into a violent period of ancient Thailand, where kingdoms, warriors, nobles, and ruthless warlords fight for power. And at the center of this brutal world is a young boy named Tien, whose life is about to be destroyed by betrayal, violence, and the murder of his family. But before Tien becomes the extraordinary fighter audiences eventually know, he is simply the son of a respected nobleman who believes that honor and loyalty are more important than political power. And this peaceful beginning makes the tragedy that follows even more powerful, because Tien grows up surrounded by privilege and tradition, yet his father's position also places the family in danger, as powerful enemies begin viewing them as obstacles to their own ambitions, and the political environment around Tien becomes increasingly unstable, with rival factions fighting for control and powerful men using assassinations and deception to remove anyone who stands in their way. And Tien's father is eventually targeted by people who want to destroy his influence, forcing the young boy to witness events that will permanently change his life, because the people he trusts are betrayed, His family is attacked and the security he once believed he had disappears almost overnight. And Tien is forced to confront violence before he is old enough to understand the complicated politics behind it, and the emotional impact of these events becomes the foundation of his transformation, because Tien does not simply lose his family, he loses his identity, his home, and the future he was supposed to have, and from that moment forward his life becomes a struggle for survival, while the people responsible for his suffering continue to hold positions of power, and this creates the central motivation that will eventually drive Tien toward becoming a warrior. But at the beginning of his journey, Tien is still inexperienced and vulnerable, and although he has been raised around martial traditions, he does not yet possess the extraordinary fighting ability that will later make him one of the most dangerous warriors in the story, and this vulnerability makes his situation even more tragic because he cannot simply fight his way out of the danger surrounding him. So when his enemies move against his family, Tien is captured and thrown into a world where survival depends on strength, instinct, and the willingness to fight, and the young boy who once lived in a world of honor is suddenly forced to witness cruelty on a scale he never imagined, and as Tien struggles to survive, he encounters people who recognize that he possesses unusual potential, even though that potential has not yet been developed, and one of the most important figures in his transformation is a mysterious warrior connected to a group of fighters who understand many different martial arts traditions, and this encounter changes the direction of Tien's life because instead of allowing the boy to remain helpless, the warriors begin teaching him how to survive, and Tien's education is not based on one single fighting style because the world he enters is filled with different martial arts techniques, weapons, philosophies, and combat traditions, and this becomes one of the defining characteristics of Ong Bak too, because Tien's fighting style eventually becomes a combination of multiple disciplines, reflecting not only his physical training but also the different teachers and warriors who influence him along the way. And as Tien begins learning, he discovers that martial arts are not simply about punching, kicking, or defeating an opponent. They are also about balance, timing, discipline, awareness, patience, and understanding the weaknesses of another fighter. And this lesson is extremely important because Tien's greatest weakness at this stage is his anger, and his anger is understandable because he has lost almost everything. But uncontrolled anger can make a fighter reckless, and the people training him understand that if Tien allows hatred to control him, he may become no better than the people who destroyed his family. So his training becomes a battle between his desire for revenge and the discipline required to become a true warrior, and this internal struggle is one of the most important aspects of Tien's character because he is not simply learning how to fight physically, he is learning how to control the emotions that could ultimately destroy him, and the training itself becomes extremely demanding, with Tien being exposed to different weapons and combat methods that force him to adapt constantly, and instead of becoming an expert in only one discipline, he gradually learns to combine different techniques into a unique fighting system, and this makes him unpredictable because an opponent cannot easily determine what style Tien will use next, and one moment he may rely on powerful strikes, while another moment he may use fluid movement, grappling, weapon techniques, or deceptive footwork, and this variety eventually becomes one of his greatest advantages. But before Tien reaches that level, he must endure years of difficult training, and the process is not easy because he is often physically exhausted, emotionally unstable, and haunted by memories of his family, and every time he remembers the people he lost, his desire for revenge becomes stronger. But his teachers continue reminding him that revenge without discipline will only lead to destruction, and this creates a powerful contrast between the boy Tien was and the warrior he is becoming, because the young Tien is driven by emotion, while the future warrior must learn to turn that emotion into controlled strength, and this transformation is shown through the physical challenges he faces, because his body is pushed beyond what he believed possible, and he learns how to move faster, strike harder, maintain balance, and use his entire body as a weapon. But the most important lesson is that no fighter can rely on strength alone because every opponent has different abilities, and survival requires intelligence, adaptability, and awareness. And as Tien continues training, he is introduced to different warriors who each possess their own unique fighting methods, and these encounters expand his understanding of combat, because instead of viewing martial arts as separate systems, Tien begins understanding that every style has strengths and weaknesses, and the key to becoming a great fighter is learning how to use those strengths while protecting against those weaknesses, and this philosophy eventually shapes the way he fights, making him extremely difficult to predict. And the training environment also introduces Tien to a different kind of family, because although he has lost his biological family, the warriors who train him begin becoming important figures in his life, giving him guidance, discipline, and a sense of belonging. And this is significant because Tien's emotional journey is not simply about revenge, it is also about finding a new identity after losing the old one. And the martial arts community becomes the place where he begins rebuilding himself, but the memories of his past never disappear, and whenever he thinks about the people responsible for his suffering, the old anger returns, and this creates moments where Tien must choose between patience and revenge, and the people training him understand that this choice will ultimately determine what kind of warrior he becomes, because a fighter who cannot control his emotions can be defeated even by a weaker opponent, while a fighter who understands his emotions can use them as fuel without allowing them to control his decisions. And Tien slowly begins learning this